There is nothing quite so exhilarating as studying the Bible. Now, I realize for the average Christian, they don't want to study the Bible too deeply. But the more you study the Bible, the more enhanced it becomes, the more entrenched with it you become. And to me, this is a part of Christian growth. Isaiah gives us one of the most fascinating studies, I believe, that we've had in a long time, Gary. There are 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, divided into two divisions. Isaiah actually becomes a miniature Bible. And on today's program, we're going to look at Isaiah's miniature Bible and see some of the fascinating chapters and how they relate to the book, the various books that they represent. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the fascinating world of Isaiah's miniature Bible.
And J.R., like the Bible itself, Isaiah's vista is universal in scope. It begins with creation. It ends with the new heavens and the new earth. It's divided into 66 chapters, 39 of which are the 39 books of the Old Testament, 27 of which are the 27 books of the New Testament. That is, it's divided exactly like our present Bible, and yet Isaiah wrote it in the 7th and 8th centuries, far, far long before our present Bible was complete.
You know, there have been a number of theologians and commentaries that have suggested that Isaiah is a miniature Bible because of the two divisions, 39 and 27, making a total of 66, which match the books of the Bible. But they never seem to go far enough, Gary, as to look at each individual chapter and show how the chapter 1 corresponds with the theme written in the book of Genesis. In chapter 2, the theme in the book of Exodus. In chapter 3, the theme in the book of Leviticus, and so on, all the way through 66 chapters and 66 books. They are there. Now listen, Isaiah wrote, in the 7th century BC, before most of the Bible was put together.
That's correct.
And yet he lays out the outline. It had to be by divine design.
Divine design, and that's exactly what this study is all about. Now, on today's broadcast, we're going to discover the Old Testament portion of Isaiah, which will be 39 chapters resembling or relating to the 39 books of the Old Testament. And of course, as you yourself can easily see, there's no way we can fit all 39 chapters into a 30-minute broadcast. I just want to tell you that in Prophecy in the News, our monthly magazine, we're going to detail this study so that you can study it yourself in depth.
Over the next several months.
Yes.
It's going to take several months. This is like writing a book.
Yes, it is.
Now, this is very enhancing, very, very filled with the commentary that it just takes time to put it down on paper, doesn't it?
That's right. And one more word before we begin. The Old Testament, in its original form, before Christ, was divided into 22 scrolls or books. And we recombine the chapters of Isaiah into the 22 original divisions of the Old Testament, and they then appear in a perfect accordance with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And that's the way we're going to proceed on this study. It's an alphabetic design, but it's also a divine design in which Isaiah's prophecy corresponds to the books of the Bible.
Now let's take chapter 1, for example. Chapter 1 obviously corresponds with Genesis. You know, in Genesis we see the Creator, we see the fall of Adam, we see the various stories, and Isaiah chapter 1 certainly lends to that, doesn't it, Gary?
It really does. As a matter of fact, we have in the second verse of Isaiah 1, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they've rebelled against me." That's a thumbnail, J.R., that really reflects the whole theme of Genesis.
All of mankind through Adam. Adam, the federal head of the human race, rebelled against me. That's the bottom line, isn't it?
And it is. And in fact, the reason that God created the first couple, allowed Satan to do his evil will, was for the purpose of redemption. Satan meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And you find this theme throughout Isaiah.
And here in chapter 1, we have a reference to one of the stories in the book of Genesis. Your country is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant. We should have been as Sodom, we should have been like unto Gomorrah. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah were burned with fire in the book of Genesis. This is chapter 1 of Isaiah. Fascinating. Let's look at chapter 2, Gary, for there we see the story of Exodus.
We do indeed, and we have in the second verse of chapter 2, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. Now, the mountain of the Lord, J.R., reminds us very much of the mount where Moses received the Ten Commandments.
And that's the book of Exodus, isn't it?
It sure is.
Sinai and the house of the Lord, the tabernacle, that's the story of the book of Exodus, absolutely targeted right here in chapter 2 of Isaiah. So we have in chapter 2 the story of the second book of the Bible.
We do, and by the way, we have here the destruction of the world system, looking far, far into the future. That's really a model or is modeled by the plagues that God inflicted upon the house of Pharaoh, which is a type of the world. And so we really do have a long Exodus theme. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to study this at length, we're going to be including all these studies, book by book, in our magazine, Prophecy in the News.
Now, in chapter 3, we not only have Leviticus shown, but we have the judgment that God promised to the people in the book of Leviticus, especially as we get toward those last chapters. You know, when God talks about their cities being desolate, you know, and them scattered to the slave markets of the world so that the land can enjoy its Sabbaths. Listen, for example, it says in verse 8, Jerusalem is ruined, Judah is fallen. That's incredible, isn't it?
You know, J.R., we have here in Isaiah 3, corresponding to Leviticus, the fact that the people of Israel have failed to live up to what God required of them. Leviticus, the key verse says, be ye holy. The Lord being holy, he urges his people to be holy. Well, they failed to do it, and they're receiving judgment here in chapter 3. The first chapter corresponding to Aleph, creation. The second chapter of Isaiah corresponding to Beit, which is the house. And we read that verse, shall come to pass in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house. And then this third chapter corresponds to Leviticus and God's loving kindness. And J.R., this is tough love.
Yeah. And it says here in verse 14, the Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and with the princes thereof. So it certainly appears to be a reference back to the ancients in Leviticus and his original promise that he will judge them if they do not keep the sabbatical cycles. And of course, verse 26, her gates shall lament and mourn, she shall be desolate. And that's exactly what Leviticus says, desolate.
Indeed. And now the next chapter, the fourth chapter of Isaiah, corresponds with the fourth book of the Bible, Numbers. And Numbers is the way through the wilderness. And the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Dalet, the way. J.R., verses 5 and 6 here give us literally a picture of the wilderness.
As they went through the wilderness, in the center of the camp, there was a tabernacle. And above the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle, a cloud of smoke by day, a shining, flaming fire by night. Tell us what those verses say in chapter 4.
Oh, yeah. Verse 5 says, the Lord will create upon every dwelling of Mount Zion, upon her assemblies, a cloud, and smoke by day, shining of flaming fire by night, for upon all the glory shall be a defense. And there shall be a tabernacle for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, and for a place of refuge, and for a covert from storm and from rain.
That's certainly the wilderness chapter, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And fits nicely with the Dalet, which means the way through the wilderness. Let's talk about chapter 5 for just a moment. Hay and Deuteronomy. There's a big hay in Deuteronomy, too, by the way.
There certainly is. Deuteronomy, as we have said here many times, is the book of the big hay, hay being the breath of God. And chapter 5 is a parable of a vineyard in which the children of Israel have been charged with producing fruit, and they've failed to do so. And God pronounces 6 woes upon them.
Well, when we come back, we're going to look at some of the other chapters in the first 39 chapters of Isaiah and show you the remarkable comparison between the chapter and the particular book it represents in the Old Testament. We'll be back in a moment. Isaiah is one of the most fascinating of the prophets. He is called the chief prophet, and as chief of the Old Testament prophets, he gives us a literal overview of the Old Testament and the New Testament. As he writes 66 chapters, we have 66 books in the Bible. Chapters 11 and 12 seem to be the ones that fit 1st and 2nd Kings, Gary. This is a great study here.
Indeed. 1st and 2nd Kings, and when you go into Isaiah 11 and 12, corresponding to 1st and 2nd Kings, you read in 11:1, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." That's the Davidic kingdom. And J.R., 1 Kings chapters 1, 2, and 3 and on begin to chronicle the days of the building of the temple under Solomon and the actual substantiation of the Davidic kingdom. We have the exact words of that apply to the setting up of the kingdom in the far future. And then 2 Kings, corresponding to Isaiah 12, the 4th verse says, "And in that day ye shall say, Praise the Lord, call upon his name, declare his doings among the people, make mention that his day is exalted." And chapter 12 goes on to talk about the setting up of the Messianic kingdom. So perfectly corresponding to the prophetic nature of 1st and 2nd Kings.
Yeah. Skipping around just a little bit because we don't have time to get all of these chapters in, but you can read it all in the upcoming months of our magazine, Prophecy in the News. Chapter 18 especially sounds like Job. He's the one that suffered, didn't he?
Indeed. As a matter of fact, the 18th chapter here of Isaiah, corresponding to the book of Job, talks about a group of people who are called scattered and peeled. They're a kind of a woe-begone group of people, and they live beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. And J.R., there are people suffering down there, far removed from things like Job. And yet, in the end, at the end of this chapter, "In that time shall the present be brought unto the Lord of hosts from a people scattered and peeled, from a people terrible from their beginning hitherto." Corresponding to the Ethiopian Jews, we believe, who came back bringing possibly the ark to Israel. Well, the beginning of these people was horrific. They suffered. In the end, however, they were redeemed, and it corresponds very nicely with the book of Job.
And the theme in Job, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Chapter 19 is our Psalms chapter. And you know, the interesting thing about it is back in around 1983, we discovered that the Psalms literally tell the story of this century. Each Psalm depicts a year numbered according to the Psalm, and we have been following this since 1983 and are just absolutely astounded with the way the Psalms describe the events of this century. Well, I want you to know that Isaiah 19 fits the mold perfectly. Mm-hmm. It is the story of this century. Let's look at 19 for a moment. Talks about the burden of Egypt and how Egypt is going to have a civil war. This goes back to the birth of Israel, 1948, and following the war with Israel in 1948, the Egyptians turned against the Egyptians, and they had a civil war, and King Farouk, which we see in verses 2 and 3, was deposed, and the people were turned over to a cruel lord and a fierce king, Abdul Nasser. And it says here in verse 4, "I'll give them over into the hand of a cruel lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them." That would be Nasser. And then, of course, right after that, they began to build the Aswan Dam. We're talking about the 1960s here. And the waters shall fail from the sea, verse 5 says, and it goes on to describe what happens to the Nile once that dam is set in place. And the fishers shall mourn, and so on. We get down to verse 13, we have the 6-day war. And the princes of Zoan are become fools. And in fact, Israel, the land of Judah, verse 17, shall be a terror unto Egypt. That's 6-day war there, Gary, because Israel fought Egypt and handily won in 6 days. And then, of course, conquering the Sinai Peninsula, 5 Egyptian cities were occupied by Israelis. And it says in verse 18, in that day shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan. And then, of course, came Anwar Sadat in verse 19. We have this Messiah figure who made peace with Israel. It says, in that day there shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the border thereof to the Lord. There shall be a sign, a witness. And it says in verse 21, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord and shall perform it. And they shall make sacrifice and oblation. Well, their Messiah was killed. Anwar Sadat was assassinated. And he was buried in the tomb of the unknown warrior under the form of a pyramid. And so they sacrificed him. And then they made a peace treaty with Israel. And they're keeping the peace treaty. And then, of course, it says, the Lord shall smite Egypt. He shall heal it. And this has happened to Egypt, or will one of these days. It says here there will be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria. That highway exists today from Egypt into Israel, and that was a part of the peace treaty. So this 19th chapter of Isaiah chronicles the years of this century, and that's exactly what the Psalms do as well.
And going to chapter 21, J.R., and that is an amazing exposition. Going to chapter 21, prophecies against Babylon, corresponding to the book of Ecclesiastes. Well, Ecclesiastes is the book of the world, the life under the sun, the secular world. And you know, we have here also the representation of the symbol of the letter Ayin. Here, and Ayin is sight and insight. And J.R., this is just loaded with references to vision and seeing and watching and watchtower and saw and watchman 3 times, watchman, watchman, what of the night. And this is talking about prophecies against Babylon and Edom, but it's all set in the framework of watching or seeing. Again, we don't have time to go into all the detail, but it's phenomenal to note how it corresponds with the book of Ecclesiastes. And J.R., I have to quickly move to the next one. Chapter 22, corresponding to the Song of Solomon, has as its 4th verse, therefore, said I, look away from me, I will weep bitterly, labor not to comfort me because of the spoiling of the daughter of my people. Practically copying the words from the Song of Solomon, look not upon me, because I am black or sunburned, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children are angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept. And J.R., that's practically word for word out of Isaiah.
Incredible. I like chapter 24. It corresponds with the book of Jeremiah. You remember Jeremiah was the leading commentator on the sabbatical years in Leviticus 25 and 26, which says, if you don't keep every 7th year and let the land lay fallow, I'll scatter you to the slave markets of the world so that the land will lay desolate and enjoy its Sabbaths. And Jeremiah was the one who chronicled all of that. And verse 3 says in Isaiah 24, the land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. That's a reference to Jeremiah and to Leviticus 25 and 26. Incredible, isn't it?
It is. Isaiah 26 corresponds to the book of Ezekiel and also the letter Resh, the wicked. And J.R., it's a fact that the prophecy of Ezekiel talks about the destruction of the wicked and the building of the great millennial temple. And that's exactly what we have in Isaiah 26. Let favor be showed to the wicked, yet will he not learn righteousness. And the verse 14, they are dead, they shall not live, they are deceased, they shall not rise, referring to the wicked.
Well, you know, in Ezekiel The Valley of Dry Bones.
Yes.
We mentioned this a few weeks ago in a program, Thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise, a reference to the restoration of Israel, followed then by the resurrection of all the saints. Mm-hmm. Tremendous.
Oh, and the next chapter, Daniel, and we don't have much time here, but Daniel is represented by Isaiah chapter 27, and Daniel, of course, is the prophecy of the four beasts, and the fourth beast is the same as the beast that rises up out of the sea in Revelation 13. And look at the first verse of Isaiah 27. In that day the Lord with his sore and great strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent. Well, J.R., that's Daniel's fourth beast.
You slay the dragon in the sea.
Yeah.
This book of Isaiah is absolutely uncanny when it comes to an overview or a synopsis of each of the books of the Old Testament. And when we get to chapters 40 through 66, we'll see the books of the New Testament. And we'll catch that on our next program. But Gary, this book of Isaiah, it's calling to the people, come and study me. He's the chief prophet. He's the big main one to look at as Israel is facing the Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian captivities.
And the true message of Isaiah, and I could take hours to talk about this one, I love it. The true message of Isaiah is that the Bible was not written by men, but was written by God, because men could not have so many centuries in advance pre-structured a prophecy that would look like a Bible that didn't come into existence for another 1,000 years.
Yeah. And so the first 39 chapters of Isaiah talk about law. The next 27 will talk about grace. Fascinating. We'll be back in just a moment.